Many people think that belief must come first. Before you begin, you must be ready. You must have belief in yourself. Either belief exists, or it does not. And if it does not, you wait until it arrives, searching for answers to these questions. But could it be the other way around? What if belief arises after action? There was once a man who had no reason whatsoever to believe in himself. His past was ordinary. His means were limited, and the people around him were not sources of motivation. He did not begin with belief. He began from almost nothing. And yet, over time, something happened, quietly and gradually, something that changed not only his circumstances, but his understanding of himself. By the time the results became visible on the outside, everything on the inside had already changed completely. That change did not come from a single moment of belief. It did not come from someone believing in him first, nor from an early string of successes that made him feel good about his chances. He repeated without waiting for any external validation, without knowing whether it was working. He kept telling himself a different story, not out loud, not with forced motivation either, simply consistently, every day, returning to a self-image that was slightly larger than the image the world had assigned him. This seemed too simple to take seriously. And that is precisely why most people rejected it before even starting. We are taught that reality is what we see before us. Self-assessment must be based on evidence. Believing something about yourself without proof is simply empty fantasy. An empty fantasy, they say, does not pay the bills. But here is exactly what this view completely misses. The story you tell yourself about yourself is not a passive reflection of reality. It is an active ingredient in creating it. When you consistently see yourself as someone capable of a certain life, your behavior, in small, almost imperceptible ways, begins to align with that image. The decisions you make, the risks you take, the things you reach for, and the things you do not even attempt to reach for, all of it is quietly shaped by the story running in the background. When you change the story, you change the behavior. When you change the behavior, the results also change. Not instantly, not all at once, but it is real. It works whether you want it to or not. Now look at the story you are telling yourself, not the version you tell others, the story that exists inside you, the story of who you are. When a new opportunity arrives, a difficult test, a moment that requires you to step beyond where you were a moment ago, it automatically kicks in and you begin to think, what does that voice say? For most people, it says something limiting. Not harshly, not dramatically, just practically. It reminds you of the times things did not go well. It shows you the gap between where you are and where you are supposed to be. It wisely and calmly suggests that perhaps this particular thing is not for someone like you. That voice feels like honesty. It feels like self-awareness. It feels responsible. But it is not telling you the truth. It is telling you a story written by your past, not by your potential. The past is not a reliable guide showing what is possible. It is simply a recorded archive of what has happened. The man who changed his life was not naive about his past. He knew where he had come from, what he did not have. He did not pretend those things were absent. He simply decided not to allow them to write the next chapter, and he moved forward with that. That decision, consciously choosing a different story, is a decision most people never make. Not because they are incapable of making it, but because believing in something the evidence does not yet support feels self-contradictory. But this is precisely where the important understanding about belief lies. Belief is not an outcome. It is not something you arrive at once the evidence comes in. That is certainty, and certainty about the future is something no one possesses. Belief is a decision made in advance. It is a commitment to a version of yourself that does not yet exist, but toward which you are going. The effect this kind of belief has on you is remarkable. When you perceive yourself as someone more capable, more powerful, you begin to see opportunities. They were there all along. You simply began to notice them because your mind was built around that image, and you began to see reality. The same world looks entirely different, depending on the story you are running about yourself. This is not a metaphor. It is how attention works. A person who believes they can find a way tends to find a way. Not because the universe rewards optimism, but because their attention is calibrated differently. They look for paths. And people who look for paths find them far more often than those who search for reasons why there is no path. This process compounds over time in ways that are difficult to track, but impossible to ignore. This is not a limitation. The foundation of belief is small, consistent decisions. From the outside, it looks like a life built by someone who had everything come together. But from the inside, each choice quietly folds into place. It is precisely the right moment to choose a story slightly larger than the small, safe story. And now there is a part that makes this genuinely difficult. Belief, real belief, is not something you ignite once and maintain without difficulty. It is constantly tested. The world is full of evidence for the limiting story. Setbacks happen. Others succeed at the very things you are struggling with. The gap between your current reality and what you desire does not narrow as quickly as you had hoped. On those days, the small story feels true. It has evidence. It is supported by recent experience. The larger story, meanwhile, feels thin, something you made up. On those days, you do not need faith. You simply need to return. That return is the real practice. Not the inspired, luminous moments, but the quiet, entirely ordinary act of choosing the larger story on a day when the smaller story seems convincing. This is what creates the difference between those who ultimately shape reality through belief and those who fade at the first difficulty. The essential strength is not the initial feeling. It is returning consistently and acting out of that consistency. You return to the image of who you are. You keep it clear. You allow your decisions, small, ordinary ones, to come not from the available evidence, but from that image. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the available evidence begins to change. Not all at once. Not in ways that are immediately obvious, but in ways that accumulate and build upon each other, ultimately creating something undeniable. This was the trajectory that man found himself on. Not a sudden change, but a gradually compounding alignment between the story he was telling himself and the life he was building. When the results became visible to others, they forgot that the inner work had been going on for years. They only saw the result. They did not see the daily ordinariness, the quiet choices, the moments of doubt he passed through without allowing them to rewrite the story. It was almost always like this. The visible success was only the final stage of a long internal process no one had seen. And this shows that looking at someone else's result to assess where you should be on your own path was not a fair measure. You can only ask whether you have done the inner work, whether you have been telling yourself a story large enough to move you forward, whether you have returned consistently enough for that story to become more real than the limitations with which you began. If the answer is clearly yes, you are further along than you think. If the answer is no, if the story you are running is still the one your past gave you, then the place to begin is not strategy, resources, or timing. It is the story. When you change the belief you hold about yourself, the direction in which you reach also changes. When you change the direction in which you reach, what you find also changes. As what you find changes, your life quietly, gradually, and undeniably shifts into a different shape. This does not happen simply because you wanted it enough. It happens because you chose the larger story, returned to it consistently, and allowed belief to do its work. And you simply began to become aware of this, finding your way toward reality. One day you look back and see that the distance between who you were and the person you wanted to become did not happen in a single leap. It continued to unfold through a quiet, consistent returning.